Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Good News Tour, a conference that is entirely about God. And I know not all of you were here yesterday, so I thought I'd briefly summarize some of the things that we talked about. First of all, we discussed the great importance of knowing the true character of God. And not in a detached or impersonal way, but that we know the truth about God, we like that He is that way, and that we come into this knowing, intimate relationship with Him. So how do we know what God is like? We discussed Jesus. And the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Where is this so-called Father of yours?" And Jesus said, "You're looking right at me, and you don't see me. How do you expect to see the Father? If you knew me, you would at the same time know the Father." So if we know Jesus, we know the Father. They are the same in their kindness, their graciousness, their gentleness, and even their humility. And we discussed this great war that began up in heaven. And we described this as the real issues are a distortion, a misrepresentation of the kind of person God is in character. And so, Jesus, to clear this up, the Son of God, appeared for this very reason, to destroy what the devil had done. Now, what had the devil managed to accomplish? Well, he's caused us to believe a lie about the character of God. God himself is a liar. He's arbitrary, severe, harsh, vengeful, one to be greatly feared. And so to solve this problem, only God in the flesh could really answer the questions. So Jesus himself became like them and shared their human nature. He did this so that through his death, he might destroy the devil. Now, the devil, of course, didn't actually die physically at the cross, but he was exposed, and the principles of his kingdom were revealed to be a sham. And so God ultimately won the war through the revelation of his character of love. And on that note, Paul in Colossians said, "And on that cross, Christ freed himself from the power of the spiritual rulers and authorities. He made a public spectacle of them, leading them as captives in his victory procession." And I don't know about you, but I had the feeling yesterday that the lies that were told about God were made a public spectacle. And so, through the Son then, God decided to bring the whole universe back to himself. God made peace through his Son's blood on the cross, and so brought back to himself all things, both on earth and in heaven. At one time, you were far away from God because of the evil things you did and thought. But now, by means of the physical death of his Son, what happened? God has made you his friends. And I think it's also very significant here, who was the enemy? We were God's enemies. Don't we sometimes describe God as being the one who had the problem? God had to be reconciled to us, but it's entirely the other way. Jesus came to reveal the love of God, to reconcile us back to God. And so, I thought to illustrate this, and because this came up so much yesterday in the questions that you submitted, people asked again and again, why are we still here? If the war was won, what are we still doing? Well, I think here it is. And this good news about the kingdom, this good news about the king of the kingdom, this good news about the way the king runs his kingdom will be preached through all the world, and then the end will come. And this verse gives me great hope, because here and in so many other places, Daniel and Revelation, it is strongly stated that this message about the character of God will be heard around the world. And I think there's another piece to the puzzle, though. Here at the end of Romans, Paul says, "And God, our source of peace, will soon crush Satan under your feet." Now, notice here who does the crushing. It's God, but he does it through his church, through his friends. And can we state specifically, how does this work? And I thought in the next few minutes, I would just review and contrast the principles of God's kingdom and the principles of Satan's kingdom, because we really need to clearly understand the issues here. And I think if we could use one word to describe the principle of God's kingdom, it would be unselfishness. And by contrast, if we could use one word To describe the principles of Satan's kingdom, it would be selfishness, survival of the fittest. And let me illustrate this in a few different ways. God, of course, has unlimited power, but he does not use this power forcibly to win the war, but rather in his unselfishness, his other-centered love, he descends. And Ty talked about this so well yesterday, that the God who alone possesses immortality and lives in unapproachable light, whom no human has ever seen or is unable to see, that God lived in a womb for 9 months and lived among us. The infinite life of God himself took shape before us. And of course, in his great humility, he had no dignity or beauty to make us take notice of him. There was nothing attractive about him from a physical perspective, nothing that would draw us to him. He lived in Nazareth, the place from which it was said, "Can any good thing come from Nazareth?" And so we contrast Jesus descending with the attitude of the enemy. You said in your heart, "I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High." Satan selfishly is trying to push and promote higher and higher. And we read in Revelation, everyone worshipped the dragon. It made fire to come down out of heaven to earth and in the sight of everyone. Pride, desire for worship and praise, the methods of fear, force, intimidation, down on your knees, these are Satan's methods. And we discussed yesterday that Satan, he will go in and sit down in God's temple and claim to be God. And as we discussed, in this temple, we are priests, we are stones in the temple, we are pillars in the temple, and Paul very clearly says, you yourselves are the temple. And so if Satan is going to sit down in a temple, does he physically in heaven throw God off his throne and sit down? Or in a physical building in Jerusalem? Or is not the meaning that the battle is entirely waged in the mind? Are we settled into the truth about God, or are we settled into the lies that are told about God? Satan, puffed up with pride, claims to be a god. You say that like a god, you sit on a throne surrounded by the seas. And so Satan selfishly desires to be God, and his followers share his lust for pride and self-exaltation. Now contrast Jesus. I am the good shepherd who is willing to die for my sheep. No one takes my life away from me. I give it up of my own free will. And later on, the greatest love a person can have for his friends is to give his life for them. And God, of course, could do nothing less than to reveal his greatest love. And we said yesterday, we read this verse, Jesus knew that the Father had given him complete power. What does God do with complete power? He rose from the table, took off his outer garment, and tied a towel around his waist and washed dirty feet. And as we said, this painting is not meant to evoke any kind of a political message, although it could be interpreted that way. The point is that in this room of extremely powerful people, the one ultimately with all the power is the one who takes off his outer garment, kneels down, and washes dirty feet, and that is our God. Contrast again, Satan, in the wilderness of temptation, asks God himself to get down on his knees. Therefore, if you will do homage to and worship me, it shall all be yours. Isn't this incredible? Our God kneels and washes dirty feet, and Satan even has the audacity to ask God to get down on his knees. And so in this remarkable quote, unselfishness, the principle of God's kingdom. Not a principle, not one of many principles, but the principle of God's kingdom is the principle that Satan hates. Its very existence he denies. From the beginning of the great controversy, he has endeavored to prove God's principles of actions to be selfish, and he deals in the same way with all who serve God. To disprove Satan's claim is the work of Christ and of all who bear his name. It was to his own life an illustration of unselfishness that Jesus came in the form of humanity. And all who accept this principle are to be workers together with him in demonstrating it in practical life. Now, how often have you heard this described? Someone asks, well, why did Jesus come? Why did he die? Well, I think he came to demonstrate that the principle of God's kingdom is unselfishness. I haven't heard that answer given too many times, but I think we could put that right up there with all of the other explanations for why Jesus came. And so we ask, if this is the principle of God's kingdom, we read the Bible to find out, does it work? And so right after the garden, we read about Cain and Abel. One demonstrated selfishness, the other unselfishness. Of course, we know what happened. Isaiah, sawed in half in a hollow log. Jeremiah, thrown in a well, sunk down in the mud, eventually stoned in Egypt. And Paul summarizes all of these people in the Old Testament. Some were mocked and whipped, and others were put in chains and taken off to prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were killed by the sword. They went clothed in skins of sheep or goats, poor, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not good enough for them. They wandered like refugees in the desert and hills, living in caves and holes in the ground. And of course, the history goes on. John the Baptist, beheaded. Jesus, the ultimate demonstration of unselfishness, crucified. James, Peter, and Paul, I had to cut this passage short, goes into such great detail about his life. 5 times I was given the 39 lashes by the Jews. 3 times I was whipped by the Romans, and once I was stoned. I have been in 3 shipwrecks and once spent 24 hours in the water, and you know this passage goes on and on with the details of his persecution. And so, what is the point here? Whose principle is stronger? And you could almost make the argument that in this earth's history, survival of the fittest is a stronger principle. But of course, there's one key element, and I think it's this. God's kingdom does not belong to this world. Now, what would happen if within Satan's kingdom, a people actually did live out God's principle? And of course, it did happen, at least at one time in history. At Pentecost, in Acts 2, we read, all who believed were together and held everything in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and distributing the proceeds to everyone as anyone had need. Every day they continued to gather together by common consent in the temple courts, breaking bread from house to house, sharing their food with glad and humble hearts, praising God, and having the goodwill of all the people. And what is the result of all of this? And the Lord was adding to their number every day those who were being saved. It was infectious when this actually was lived out. And so Jesus is continually pointing us to this ideal way of living. And I think these words are really very difficult. And perhaps we understand why the message of Jesus was so hard to hear. What do we do with this? And if one of the occupation troops forces you to carry his pack 1 mile, carry it 2 miles. Okay, do we really do this? Your superior unfairly gives you double the work that you were supposed to do, and you double it even beyond that. What effect does that have on your superior? Is this principle foolishness? And this whole passage in Luke 7 is just incredible. But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. Now, I do love that in the Psalms, David prays the worst on his enemies. And I think that should give us some comfort, at least, that if we feel that way about our enemies, we can honestly tell God that's the way we feel. But the ideal is that we love and we wish the best on our enemies. If anyone hits you on the cheek, let him hit the other one too. If someone takes your coat, let him have your shirt as well. Give to everyone who asks you for something. And when someone takes what is yours, do not ask for it back. Do for others just what you would have them do for you. Love your enemies and do good to them. Lend and expect nothing back. Do not judge others. Do not condemn others. Forgive others. It's an incredible list, isn't it? And I just imagine just how to make this real. And just imagine that every single person in this room knew each very specifically of your individual character flaws. A very, very scary thought. But imagine that that were true, but yet despite that knowledge, and perhaps even a knowledge of some false theology that you might have, that no one judges you, no one condemns you, and no one rushes over even to correct your false theology. But instead, you experience love, acceptance, encouragement, and community. And of course, the beautiful thing is that in this environment, restoration and healing occurs. And to me, almost the greatest miracle of Jesus was the woman caught in adultery. And we said yesterday, he said to her, "I do not condemn you." Now, where's the miracle in that? Well, it's a much greater miracle because she had a restored mind and heart, and that is the greatest miracle of all. And so I think as we truly love and do not condemn others, we are working out that miracle of God within the hearts and minds of our brothers and sisters. And this last verse here to illustrate this, Paul says, the scriptures also say, if your enemies are hungry, give them something to eat. And if they are thirsty, give them something to drink. This will be the same as piling burning coals on their heads. And again, trying to think of another specific practical example. I work at a very large university hospital near here. And as you can imagine, parking is at a premium. And everyone is trying to get the best lot, the closest place. And I would imagine that those in administration and at the top probably get preference to the best parking places. But what would it be like if those administrators said, you know, the doctors, they work so hard here. I think let's let them have the best parking place. And if the doctors got together and they said, you know, where would we be without the nurses? They do so much for us, and let them have it. And the nurses say, you know, those poor medical students, they're in so much debt, and they work so hard and study so hard. I think they should have it. And right on down the line until finally, perhaps the janitor, who was recently released from prison, has been working there for only a few months, is given the most honored parking place. And I just imagine that that janitor would either feel, you know, these people are crazy and would go somewhere else, or perhaps he would experience healing and would himself accept this principle, this way of living. So I think this is how it works. God uses us to make the knowledge about Christ spread everywhere like a sweet fragrance. For we are like a sweet-smelling incense offered by Christ to God, which spreads among those who are saved and among those who are being lost. It is a deadly stench. Among those that are being lost, it is a deadly stench that kills. But for those who are being saved, it is a fragrance that brings life. And what does it mean to be saved? It means to be healed of this horrible infection of selfishness. And so what's the ultimate? All of us have had that veil removed so that we can be mirrors that brightly reflect the glory of the Lord. As we said yesterday, the ultimate glory, it's not that God is powerful, it is his gracious character. And as the Spirit of the Lord works within us, we become more and more like him and reflect his glory, his character, even more. This is how we can be sure that we are in union with God. If we say that we remain in union with God, we should live just as Jesus Christ did. If we say that we are in the light yet hate others, we are in the darkness to this very hour. If we love others, we live in the light. Here is the clear difference between God's children and the devil's children. Those who do not do what is right or do not love others are not God's children. We know that we have left death and come over to life. Why? We know it because we love others. Those who do not love are still under the power of death. And finally, Jesus' commission. I've loved you the way my Father has loved me. Make yourselves at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done, kept my Father's commands and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy and your joy wholly mature. This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. So it is the good news about God proclaimed throughout the world that brings this horrible war to a conclusion. But this message is not just given with words. It is lived out in the lives of those who have internalized the character and the principles of God. Let's pray. Dear Father, we desire not just an intellectual understanding of the message. We desire to be changed by it, to be changed by you, to receive a new heart and a right spirit within, and that your character of love may spread like fire throughout the world. Amen.